مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. السياسة الخارجية الأميركية، هل هي ناجحة أم فاشلة؟ لنلقي نظرة على الصورة الكبيرة. 25 عاما منذ أن سقط جدار برلين، هل العالم أكثر أمنا أم أقل أمنا اليوم؟ 35 عاما منذ الثورة الإيرانية، هل نحن أكثر أمنا أو أقل أمنا؟ 40 عاما منذ انسحابنا من فيتنام، هل نحن أكثر أمنا أم أقل أمنا؟ 50 عاما منذ أزمة الصواريخ الكوبية، هل نحن أكثر أمنا أم أقل أمنا؟ هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن نلقي نظرة على الاتجاهات العريضة للسياسة الأمريكية والسياسة الخارجية، ونسأل السؤال الأكثر أهمية: كقوة عالمية هل نحن ناجحون أم فاشلون؟ ضيفي هو خبير الشؤون الدولية جوشوا ووكر. Welcome back to Dakhil, Washington. I'm here with Joshua Walker to talk about American foreign policy, success or failure. Joshua, thank you for joining us. We're going to take a step back this week, and we're going to look more broadly and ask whether American foreign policy is working. Is it a success or is it a failure, or which pieces of it are working better than others? So before we dive into all this, let me just ask your general view. American foreign policy, is it working?
I think it's really hard to give a yes-no answer to that. I think in some ways it depends on what definition of success we look at. I think we have to look regionally, of course. I think that nobody would argue that Middle Eastern policy of the U.S. has been more successful in the last couple of months or last couple of years, at least since the beginning of the Arab Spring. But maybe in a historic context, maybe since the end of the Cold War, maybe there's some silver linings there. And I think there are opportunities for success, but it seems to be a mixed bag at this point in time.
So if I were to define success as are Americans safer and more secure today than, say, while the Cold War was raging, what would your view be?
It would depend on which country, of course. You know, there are certain places during the Cold War that absolutely you were safe to be as American. There are other places in the Middle East, if you were there, you were guaranteed to become a major target. I think certainly there, because of decentralization, because of the power of the individual throughout the world, globalization in general, Americans are certainly maybe the most powerful targets in the world, and in the Middle East, unfortunately, that's true as well. But that doesn't mean that every American, doesn't mean that America as a whole is a target in every areas of the Middle East.
All right, let me ask about a number of specific grand strategy policies that we've adopted. I guess the most significant is in the wake of the Cold War, the national decision was to expand our alliance that was designed against the Soviets, to expand NATO militarily, and to urge our European partners to expand the European Union eastward as well, both a political and a military strategy to embrace the former Soviet countries, Soviet bloc countries in Eastern Europe. Has this proved to be a success?
I think it's actually probably one of the biggest successes post-Cold War. The problem, of course, and the caveat I would add, is that while it's been a huge success for the transatlantic world in terms of the European homeland, in terms of Western Europe, it has not been as successful on the edges of Europe, whether that's in Ukraine or whether that's in the Mediterranean countries throughout the Middle East. The benefits of kind of the U.S. and Europe working more closely together, the post-Cold War peace dividend that many have talked about, have not been seen in those parts of the world, while they have been seen in Western Europe. But of course, even in Western Europe, demographic changes, economic slowdown, all of these things have been negative consequences of more globalization. So again, it seems that while it may be successful in some instances, there are areas that are mixed bag.
So how do you respond to the critique that one hears, certainly from people who want to try to understand Vladimir Putin, for example, the critique that expanding NATO and having the European Union move eastward only was a pinprick into the Russian bear and forced them to lash out and be as authoritarian and nasty to neighboring countries as they've been in recent years.
I mean, there's certainly evidence there to point to it. You would look at the behavior of countries like Georgia or even Ukraine, where their individual kind of nationalist tendencies led to some of the problems. And some would say American policy facilitated that. Some would say that, NATO membership in some ways, by expanding NATO closer and closer to the Russian bear creates the problem. I don't think I would necessarily look at it that way. In other words, the countries that we've had the biggest problems with Russia are not NATO members, they're outside NATO. They're countries that have not quite made it to the doorstep of NATO yet. They're knocking on the door but have not been let in. I think many people would argue that if Ukraine had been a NATO member, we wouldn't have the same problems that we currently have in terms of the question of, are those Russian troops on the ground, or are they kind of different groups that are, sub-national groups that Putin is able to play with? Because international norms and international law have always been vague, and they've always been kind of determined by those that have power in the international system.
So if you had your druthers and were looking at the big picture of global security, would we all be better off if we had incorporated Ukraine into NATO years ago, so the Russians would have been deterred, or would that have ensured a superpower confrontation even earlier?
I guess the way I look at it is where we are today is the worst case scenario. So anything that would have altered that course would have been a good thing. So after the Orange Revolution back in 2004, 2005, and all the so-called color revolutions we saw throughout Russia's near abroad, if we had been able to embrace most successfully. Now, how Ukraine, how Georgia, how other countries would have made the transition, had adopted the guidelines that you have to be part of NATO, that's something that we can't predict. But certainly if the West, and particularly NATO membership in the U.S., had been much stronger in terms of bringing those into our orbit, I don't think we'd be in the same situation we are today.
All right, let's turn to another part of the globe, and China, emerging power. Successive administrations have decided to engage with China, not to contain China. China is not an adversary, not an enemy, not an ally, a competitor perhaps. How do you think over the last 20 some odd years, how have we done on the big China account?
It's interesting here. You mentioned the idea of kind of the U.S. has allies around the world, and then we have the so-called frenemies. These are countries that are not necessarily friends, but they're not necessarily enemies either. I think China fits nicely into this category. When it comes to U.S.-Chinese bilateral cooperation, we've seen a steady increase, whether it's on the global economic stage because we are so interdependent with one another, but when it comes to specific areas of importance to the Chinese, meaning, kind of Asia and kind of Southeast Asia in terms of China Sea areas, East China Sea, some of our allies are very concerned when it comes to the way the Japanese or the Filipinos or the Vietnamese look at their relations. They look to the U.S. and say, we're your allies, why aren't you backing us up? And I think the answer is China is too big to ignore, and it's also too big to kind of put in a very difficult situation. So it's kind of been a piecemeal approach with China. Since the great opening with Nixon and Kissinger back in the 70s, the U.S. and China have had a lot of ups and downs. I would argue we're going through a downward period right now because of domestic Chinese politics, with the protests that we've seen in Hong Kong and kind of China's more aggressive behavior in its near abroad. And the question is, what will the U.S. do if that pattern continues? Will our allies in East Asia demand a stronger stance, as Japan has already done, as other countries seem set to do in the coming days?
And give us your prognostication. We won't come back and check on you 3-5 years from now, but are we on the right path in terms of sending the messages to China of deterrence, or are we not strong enough on that path?
I think the challenge with China is we're sending mixed messages. So the U.S. government is doing one thing, but the private sector is doing another. Clearly, the private sector wants to benefit from China's economic rise. And in China, that distinction is a bit ridiculous. There is no public and private. Even these big state-owned companies, whether it's Huawei or Costco, other major companies out there, they're doing things, kind of working very closely with the Chinese government. And so I think because the U.S. doesn't have that advantage of working more closely together, we're kind of on a mixed path. If I were in the government, I think I'd take a much stronger line than some of our leaders have, but at the same time, you can't take too strong of a line. So a lot of this needs to be done behind the scenes and not directly in terms of public and kind of, open discussions.
It's in this context that the phrase popularized in the Obama administration, the pivot to Asia, I want to ask you about. How much content is there to this? Is there a pivot to Asia? What would that look like if it existed?
I mean, this is one of the great debates in Washington, as you well know. The irony, of course, is even now the administration doesn't talk about a pivot, they talk about a rebalancing, because the concept of pivoting is that you keep one foot planted and you move the other one somewhere else, like in basketball. And so when you pivot, necessarily you have to move from somewhere. So our European friend said, why are you pivoting to Asia? That means you're moving away from Europe. Our friends in the Middle East, same question. Are you really not focusing on us anymore? You're focusing on Asians. And I think the concept here is right, which is that we need to refocus a lot of our foreign policy and a lot of our assets as a nation on the parts of the world that are going to determine the 21st century. And I think clearly with over half of the population, with most of the GDP growth that we're going to see, Asia is where our future is. And as the United States, we have the ability to look from the Atlantic to the Pacific and be both a transatlantic and a trans-Pacific area. But your point's a good one, which is where's the content? Where is the there? And in many ways, the question is, what will the U.S. do differently because we're focusing on Asia? What will this president, who grew up in Indonesia, who's naturally the first trans-Pacific president we've ever seen, do differently? And it seems because of what's happening in places like Eastern Europe in terms of Ukraine, or because of the wars we're fighting in the Middle East, it'll be more and more difficult to balance when we're continually stuck in one part of the world.
And if he wanted to, what would be the one or two most visible aspects of this rebalancing?
I think the biggest aspect would actually be showing up. Asia is the furthest away from the U.S. The U.S. president probably spends less time in Asia than he does in any other region of the world because it takes so long. And so whether it's going to APEC summits or ASEAN summits, summits that may not have a lot of significance because there's not a lot of deals that are happening, but showing up matters. It's kind of the Woody Allen line of 90% of life is just being there. The U.S. president needs to be there, and sending his representative, whether it's Secretary of State or Vice President, doesn't quite matter in the same way. And when we went through sequestration a couple years back and we had to cancel, the U.S. government had to cancel its participation and President Obama stayed home to deal with the home front, that kind of had a major psychological impact in the countries he wasn't able to go to. And I think when we look at where the major flashpoints for the 21st century are, they increasingly look in terms of where they're going to be coming from will be in the Chinese and Japanese sphere. And if we don't go and we don't show up, how can we be an honest broker in that part of the world?
Okay, when we come back, we're going to move our discussion from Russia and China into the Middle East and even to the Americas in just a moment. My guest is Dr. Joshua W. Walker. He is a transatlantic fellow at the German Marshall Fund and director of global programs at the business strategy firm APCO Worldwide, specializing in foreign policy, international affairs, and public-private partnerships. Before joining the private sector, Dr. Walker worked at the U.S. Department of State in Secretary Kerry's Office of the Chief Economist, and he served in Secretary Hillary Clinton's Global Partnership Initiative as senior advisor on the Middle East and North Africa. In addition, Dr. Walker has worked for the U.S. Embassy in Ankara, Turkey, at the Turkey desk at the State Department, and with the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon. Dr. Walker received his undergraduate degree at the University of Richmond, his master's degree from Yale University, and his doctorate degree from Princeton. Not too shabby. He has the rare academic achievement of specialization in both Turkish and Japanese, two of the toughest languages in the world. So, I'm going to get at the Middle East through China. One of America's strategies is the defense of the Persian Gulf, defense of the oil lanes, of transportation and communication. But we don't actually import much from the Persian Gulf these days. We're in fact about to become exporters. China imports from the Persian Gulf. How is it that our strategy is that we are protecting the oil lanes for the Chinese? Is this a successful approach to Middle East security?
Well, I think first, it's not just for the Chinese. I think it's for all of Asia in terms of the Japanese as one of the major energy markets. But you raise a good point. A lot of Americans question this. A lot of Americans say, why are we patrolling the water lanes of the world? Why are we the global sheriff? And the beneficiaries of this, whether it's the Chinese or the Japanese or others, are not paying a price. And I think that's why a lot of Americans question the international order that was set in World War II, post-World War II, for a Cold War environment. Since the end of the Cold War, not much has changed. The UN Security Council continues to be a reflection of that power dynamic. There are many countries around the world that are beginning to question that, and the U.S. hasn't necessarily put out a bold strategy of what that looks like next. So it's a good question to ask.
Well, actually, I was going to eventually ask you about the American strategy of international organizations, international norms, the UN, et cetera. Successive administrations invest quite a lot in this strategy. Overall, on balance, has this been a wise investment for the United States?
I actually think there are a lot of areas I'm very critical of the U.S. administration on both sides in terms of parties. But I think when it comes to international organizations and international law, this has probably been the best single policy the U.S. has ever had in terms of kind of investing a very small amount of money, but having a very big payoff. And so whether it's when we need to do action in certain parts of the world and we're able to work with colleagues from around the world, whether it's at the UN, which tends to be very difficult because of the structure of it, or whether it's through the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or whether it's with other regional groupings, there's a lot of benefit here. And while it may be frustrating and it's difficult to work in an international environment because of the changes, I think in many ways this may be the most successful policy of the U.S.
Well, it's good that we have a single most successful policy, which is the lead-in to talk even more about the Middle East. How about some of our other sort of big Middle East policies, whether it is countering the spread of weapons of mass destruction? We've done this in various ways. Reconciling our friendships with Israel and Arab states, the peace process. Have these strategies worked, not worked, middling? How would you grade them?
Unfortunately, I think the Middle East as a region has probably been one of the biggest areas for failure on U.S. policy. And it's not necessarily because the U.S. is bad at this. It's just that the Middle East has so many complex issues that you've already raised. And when you look at something as difficult as the Arab-Israeli peace process, or when you look at issues that we're seeing right now in terms of the breakdown of both Iraq as a state and Syria as a state, these are not issues that any one individual nation can solve on its own. And the question is there a regional consensus? The U.S. is really good when there are very strong states and there's a deal to be made. It's not as good when there's not clear groupings on who's in control of the region. And when you look at this region of the world since the Ottoman Empire for the last 90 years, there has been no clear kind of divide in different areas. And there have been some sectarian and ethnic tensions. There have been fluid dynamics throughout the Cold War. But today it seems that we're seeing a reshuffling of the Middle East before our very eyes.
Well, as a grand strategy, do you think that we're better off sort of removing ourselves, limiting our exposure, and letting the local actors sort things out, or generally being much more engaged in trying to help them sort things out?
I certainly tend to be on the side of greater engagement, and if you're going to call yourself a global leader and a global power, you need to be engaged in some of the most tough and critical areas around the world, including the Middle East. But I would say the type of engagement needs to change. It seems that a lot of the toolkits that the United States and its successive administrations have used have been military options. I would argue that we need to kind of focus much more on the economic side of things. When you look at the economies of this region of the world, they're among some of the worst in the region and in the world, and they need to be brought up to speed. And so when you have this major disparity between the haves and the have-nots throughout the Middle East, it's clear that there needs to be a rebalancing, and the U.S. should be the champion, should be the leader with our private sector on these areas, but it's increasingly difficult to do that in a security environment in which the U.S. is always reaching for its military toolkit to figure out what to do about this radicalized group here, what do we do here in terms of a repressive government. It's very difficult in many ways to be able to have the right strategy when things are changing as quickly as they are throughout the region.
Well, it's interesting you referred to the economic aspect of this, because I did want to ask you about another major American strategy of our foreign policy, which is trade as an asset for America. We've tried to promote free trade in various parts of the globe, although our domestic politics has limited where we can do free trade. In general, has the pursuit of expanded trade, free and fair trade, has that been a net plus for the United States?
I think it's been a net plus for the United States. It's been a net plus for the world. When you look at the major kind of legacy of this administration, what they hope is that the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnerships, will be their lasting legacy. But they're missing some major parts of the world. And when you talk about the Middle East and North Africa, we have free trade agreements with countries like Morocco and Jordan. They don't do anything. They have no value, no benefit. And so if those are the successes that we're pointing to, then how can anybody in the region think that that's a great opportunity, as opposed to looking at the U.S. and looking at our economic success and the market that the U.S. represents for the young entrepreneur in Gaza or in the Palestinian territories or in other parts of the world, being able to bring them together and saying, look, we can sell. You've got some amazing kind of talent that is hidden within these authoritarian structures and crumbling regime as they are. How do we work more closely together on that?
So what would you recommend here? A broader free trade initiative toward the region, taking on big countries like Egypt and bringing them into the fold? What are you suggesting?
I think in some ways finding targeted regional engagement is the way to go. So when you work with the Egyptians, work in partnership with the Egyptians in other areas. If Egypt is the largest Arab country in this part of the world, you use that as kind of your hub or your anchor that brings everything together, and then reach out to other parts of the region. Right now, Egypt has some major divides within its own regional groupings, and whether it's states like Qatar or whether it's states like Turkey that have a different view on the Egyptian regime, how can we find commonality? Politics seems to divide us. Economics and trade seem to bring us together. So how are we able to have that? So I think from a concrete point of view, it means that the U.S. needs to look beyond simply the Defense Department, needs to look at places like Commerce, needs to look at places like Treasury, and the State Department to kind of incorporate and have more development assistance that's targeted, as opposed to simply looking at areas of the world where we need to have our own domestic interest involved.
Joshua Walker, thank you very much for joining us in Dakhil, Washington.
Thank you so much for having me.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول نجاح السياسة الأمريكية في الشرق الأوسط أو فشلها، أرجو أن تتصلوا بي مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.